The rituals of Conclave were just as they had been before: the tolling of the dead, the washing of hands, grievances, and discipline. Once again, an anonymous accusation was levied against Scythe Goddard, this time accusing him of handing out immunity too freely. "Who brings this accusation?" Goddard demanded. "Let the accuser stand and identify his or herself." Of course, no one took credit, which allowed Goddard to retain the floor. "I will admit that his accusation has merit," Goddard said. "I am a generous man, and have perhaps been too liberal in my doling of immunity. I make no excuses, and unrepentant, I throw myself on the mercy of the High Blade to levy my punishment." High Blade Xenocrates waved his hand dismissively. Yes, just sit down, Goddard. Your penance will be to shut up for a whole 5 minutes." That brought a round of laughter. Goddard bowed to the High Blade and took his seat, and although a few Scythes, including Scythe Curie, tried to object, pointing out that historically, Scythes who had overused the ring had their power to grant immunity limited to the families of the gleaned, their complaints fell on deaf ears. Xenocrates overruled all objections in the interest of speeding up the day's proceedings. "Amazing," said Scythe Curie quietly to Citra. "Goddard's becoming untouchable. He can get away with anything. I wish someone would have had the foresight to glean him as a child. The world would have been better off." Citra avoided Rowan at lunch, afraid that being seen together more than they already had might raise suspicion. She stood by Scythe Curie for lunch, and the Scythe introduced Citra to several of the greatest living Scythes. Scythe Muir, who had once been a delegate to the Global Conclave in Geneva, Scythe Mandela, who was in charge of the Bejeweling Committee, and Scythe Hideyoshi, the only Scythe known to have mastered the skill of gleaning through hypnosis. Citra tried not to be too starstruck. Meeting them almost gave her hope that the old guard could triumph against the likes of Goddard. She kept glancing over at Rowan, who once more couldn't seem to get away from the other apprentices, although she didn't know how hard he had tried. "It's a bad sign," said Scythe Hideyoshi, "when our young hopefuls gravitate so openly to the enemy." "Rowan's not the enemy," Citra blurted, but Scythe Curie put a hand on her shoulder to quiet her. "He represents the enemy," Scythe Curie said. "At least he does to those other apprentices." Scythe Mandela sighed. "There shouldn't be enemies in the Scythedom. We should all be on the same side. The side of humanity." It was generally agreed among the old guard that these were troubling times, but aside from raising objections that were repeatedly dismissed, no one took action. Citra found herself getting increasingly anxious after lunch, as the weapons manufacturers touted their wares and various motions were hotly debated. Things like whether a Scythe's ring should be worn in the left or right hand, and whether or not a Scythe should be allowed to endorse a commercial product, like running shoes or a breakfast cereal. It all seemed insignificant to Citra. Why should any of that matter when the hallowed act of gleaning was slowly devolving into Myrtle Age murder? Then, at last, it came time for the apprentice trials. As before, the candidates for Scythedom went first, having been tested the night before. Of the 4 candidates who made it through their final test, only 2 were ordained. The other 2 had to suffer the walk of shame as they exited the chamber and went back to their old lives. Citra took guilty pleasure at the fact that the girl who had been sucking up to Rowan was one of those ejected. Once the new Scythes were given their rings and took their new names, the remaining apprentices were called down front. "Today's test," announced Scythe Crevantis, "will be a competition in the martial art of Bokator. The candidates will be paired and judged on their performance." A mat was brought in and rolled out in the semicircular space in front of the rostrum. Citra took a deep breath. She had this. Bokator was a balance among strength, agility, and focus, and she had found her perfect balance. And then they stuck a blade right into the heart of her confidence. "Citra Terranova will spar against Rowan Damish." A murmur from the crowd. Citra realized that there was no random draw. They were paired intentionally, doomed to be adversaries. How could it be any other way? Her eyes met Rowan's, but his expression gave away nothing. The other matches went first. Each apprentice gave their best, but Bokator was a bruising discipline, and not everyone's strength. Some victories were close, others were routs. And then it came time for Citra and Rowan's match. Still, Rowan's expression gave her neither camaraderie nor sympathy, nor misery at having to be set against each other. "Okay, let's do this," is all he said, and they began to circle each other. Rowan knew today was the first true test, but not the one they had devised for him. Rowan's test was to look convincing but still throw the match. Goddard, Xenocrates, Crevantus, and for that matter, all of the Scythes assembled needed to believe that he was doing his best, but that his best just wasn't good enough. It began with the ritualistic rhythmic circling, then posturing and physical taunting. Rowan launched himself at Citra, threw a kick that he telegraphed with his body language, and missed her by a fraction of an inch. He lost his footing and fell down on one knee. A very good start. He turned quickly, rising, remained off balance, and she lunged toward him. He thought she would take him down with an elbow strike, but instead she grabbed him, pulling him forward even as she appeared to push him back. It brought him to balance and made it appear as if her move had failed. Then, she didn't have the leverage to do the job. Rowan backed away and caught her gaze. She was grinning at him, her eyes intensely on his. It was part of the taunting that Bokator was known for. But this was so much more. He could read her just as clearly as if she were speaking aloud. "You're not going to throw this match," her eyes said. "Fight badly, I dare you. Because no matter how poorly you try to fight, I will find a way to make you look good." Frustrated, Rowan launched himself at her again, an open palm strike at her shoulder, intentionally 2 inches off from the perfect leverage point. But she actually moved into it. His palm connected, she spun back with the force of his strike and went down. "Damn you, Citra. Damn you!" She could beat him at everything, even at losing. Citra knew from the moment Rowan made his first kick what he was up to, and it infuriated her. How dare he think he had to fight badly for her to win this match? He had grown so arrogant under Scythe Goddard that he actually thought this wouldn't be a fair fight. Sure, he had been training, but so had she. So what if he had grown stronger? That also meant he was bulkier and moved slower. A fair fight was the only way to keep their consciences clean. Didn't Rowan realize that by sacrificing himself, he'd be dooming her as well? She would sooner glean herself as her first act as Scythe than accept his sacrifice. Rowan glared at her now, furious, and it only made her laugh. "Is that the best you can do?" she asked. He threw out a low kick, just low enough for her to anticipate without any force behind it. All she needed to do was lower her stance and the kick would have no effect. Instead, she responded by raising her center of gravity just enough for the kick to knock her feet out from under her. She fell to the mat, but righted herself quickly so it wouldn't look as if she'd done it on purpose. Then, she threw her shoulder against him and hooked her right arm around his legs, applying force, but not enough to make his knee buckle. He grabbed her, twisted, flipped them both down to the mat, landing with her in the dominant position over him. He countered by forcing him to roll over and pin her. He tried to release her, but she held his arms in place so she couldn't. "What's the matter, Rowan?" she whispered. "Don't know what to do when you're on top of a girl?" He finally pulled away as she got on top. They faced each other one more time, circling in the familiar battle dance while Crevantus circled them in the other direction. Like a satellite, completely missing what was really going on between them. Rowan knew the match was almost over. He was about to win, and by winning, he would lose. He must have been crazy thinking Citra would allow him to willingly throw the match. They both cared too much about each other. Citra would never willingly accept the Scythe's ring as long as her feelings for him got in the way. And all at once, Rowan knew exactly what he had to do. With only 10 seconds left to the match, all Citra had to do was keep up the dance. Rowan was clearly the victor. 10 more seconds of guarded circling, and Crevantus would blow the whistle. But then Rowan did something Citra hadn't anticipated at all. He threw himself forward with lightning speed, not clumsy, not feigning a false incompetence, but with perfect, practiced skill. In an instant he had put her into a headlock, squeezing her neck tight tight enough for her pain nanites to kick in, and then he leaned close and snarled into her ear. "You fell right into my trap," he said. "Now you get what you deserve." Then he flung her body into the air, twisting her head the other way. Her neck broke with a loud and horrible snap, and darkness came over Citra like a landslide. Rowan dropped Citra to the ground as the crowd drew a collective gasp. Cervantes blew his whistle violently. "Illegal move! Illegal move!" Cervantes shouted, just as Rowan knew he would. "Disqualification!" The gathering of scythes began to roar. Some were furious at Cervantes. Others were spouting vitriol at Rowan for what he had done. Rowan stood stoic, letting no emotion show. He forced himself to look down at Citra's body. Her head was twisted practically backward. Her eyes were open, but no longer seeing. She was as deadish could be. He bit down on his tongue until it began to bleed. The chamber door swung open and the guards raced in, hurrying toward the deadish girl in the middle of the room. The high blade came up to Rowan. "Go back to your scythe," he said, not even trying to hide his disgust. "I'm sure he'll discipline you accordingly." "Yes, Your Excellency." Disqualification. None of them realized that, to Rowan, it was the perfect victory. He watched as the guards picked Citra up and carried her, limp as a sack of potatoes outside where no doubt an ambudrone was already waiting to take her to the nearest revival center. "You'll be fine, Citra. You'll be back with Scythe Curie in no time, but you won't forget what happened today, and I hope you never forgive me." Journal entry. I fought against the Purge. There are things I've done that I am not proud of, but I am very proud that I fought against that. I can't recall which scythe began that odious campaign to glean only those who were born mortal, but it spread throughout each regional scythedom, a viral idea in a post-viral time. Shouldn't those who were born to expect death be the sole subject of gleaning? Went the popular wisdom, but it was bigotry masquerading as wisdom, selfishness posing as enlightenment. And not enough scythes argued, because those born in the post-mortal age found mortal-borns to be too uncomfortably different in the way they thought and in the way they lived their lives. "Let them die with the age that bore them," cried the post-mortal purists in the scythedom. In the end, it was deemed a gross violation of the second commandment, and all those scythes who practiced in the purge were severely disciplined. But by then, it was too late to undo what had been done. We lost our ancients. We lost our elders. We lost our living lifeline to the past. There are still mortal-borns around, but they hide their age and their history for fear of being targeted again. Yes, I fought the purge, but the Thunderhead did not. By its own law of non-interference in scythe affairs, it could do nothing to stop the purge. All it could do was bear witness. The Thunderhead allowed us to make that costly mistake, leaving the scythedom to wallow in its own regret to this very day. I often wonder, should the scythedom run entirely off the rails and decide to glean all of humanity in a grand suicide of global gleaning? Would the Thunderhead break its non-interference law and stop it? Or would it bear witness again as we destroyed ourselves, leaving nothing behind but a living cloud of our knowledge, accomplishments, and so-called wisdom? Would the Thunderhead grieve our passing, I wonder? And if so, would it grieve as the child who had lost a parent, or as the parent who could not save its petulant child from its own poor choices? From the Gleaning Journal of H.S. Curie.